Hello class, and welcome to the second lecture in systematics. Today we're going to look at the history of systematics. Here, we're going to look at three key periods. First, ancient Greeks. Second, the Renaissance. And the third, Phylogenetic Systems period. So to start off, let's begin with the ancient Greeks. Our story begins, of course, with Aristotle. So here in this period, to Franz Stafleu, this era was characterized by, kumbaga, lukso ng damdamin. Or, quoting Francis Bacon, anticipation of nature where human reasoning is rash and premature. And this one is applied to nature. So, kung ano yung magkatulad, kung ano yung mukhang magkapareho, katulad nung naging short activity natin, ganun nila trinato ang nature. Now, zoological systematics was attributed to Aristotle. So, the first application of scientific induction to living beings is attributed to Aristotle. Okay? So for him, he was able to distinguish invertebrates into your entoma, insects. Okay? For entoma, insects were separated from Malacostra, which is your crustacea, and also from your Malachia, or your Cephalopoda. These were all separated, and this is attributed to Aristotle. Okay? So, he also was able to distinguish vertebrate classes like your reptiles, birds, and mammals. Okay? Now, we go to Aristotle's student. And his name is Theophrastus. So for Theophrastus, he divided naman the plant world into trees, shrub, undershrubs, and herbs. And he described groups of genera which we now call monocots and dicots, and even smaller groups, okay, like grasses, Liliaceae, okay? But the only thing that's a weakness perhaps by these two is that they weren't able to come up with this clear classification scheme. So, it was incomprehensible. Katulad nga ng sabi ni Francis Bacon, parang lukso ng damdamin, okay? So, dito din, sa ancient Greeks period, nauso yung paggamit ng terms katulad ng genus at species. Okay? So, in Greek, genus was spelled G-E-N-O-S, genus, and it is an expressed unity of a certain group. Okay? While species was in Greek called eidos. And this constituted the members of that group, of that genus. Okay? So, in their logic, genus or species were classes. Okay? They were just all classes. But in the 20th century, taxon was now used to refer to any rank. Okay? So, hindi ganun ka defined dati. Okay? In this period as well, there is this saying or this philosophy called tertium non datur. I'm not sure if I'm murdering the pronunciation, but it's called tertium non datur. And this means that there is no third option. Okay? Only true or false. Now, that is why neither Plato nor Aristotle did not see it necessary for us to develop a strict dichotomous key. Okay? Because for them, it was already implied, okay, that this shared characteristics by a genus was already apparent and it was already obvious for everyone. So there is no third option. There is no middle ground. Either they belong to that genus or not. Okay? So they group this species together based on that obvious shared characteristics for them at that time. Okay? So they did not see it necessary to develop a strict system or a strict key for this. And that concept or that philosophy or that saying is called tertium non datur. Okay, that's what Franz Stoflu said in the reading. Okay. So also, in this way, we can say now that deductive reasoning was used. Okay? This was what was used before. They deduced only from their own notion na sila yung magkakagrupo. Okay? So, they also deduced that it is only logical to make divisions based on important features of life. And what were these important features? Diba? So, kung si Aristotle, dun siya sa zoological systems or zoological systematics, for Theophrastus, it was more on the plants. So, for animals, these key features, okay, of life was your circulatory system. Okay? Those with red blood and those without. Okay? And then for plants, it was on growth and reproduction. Okay, so they classified organisms based on these important features. For plants, it was growth and reproduction. And for your animals, it was the circulatory system. Okay? Ayan. One thing that we should remember about Aristotle as well, being also a philosopher, was his principle of the ladder of nature. Okay? So in this principle, there exists a hierarchy. Okay? Existing levels. So from your non-living things to, of course, the highest point, which is humankind, and then gods. Okay? So this is also very much tied to religion. Okay? So here, there was a hierarchy, okay? And because this was highly accepted that humankind was on the top of the ladder, was on the top of that hierarchy system, no research was made, okay? So it was simply accepted. And that's where the danger comes in, okay? So now we move to the Renaissance period. During the Renaissance, we will look at a lot of botanists, zoologists, okay, and scientists at the time. So let us first look at our herbalists. And these include Otto Brunfels, Leonhard Fox, and Conrad Gessner. So this period opened an unbiased way of looking at nature. This independence was reflected in illustrations, okay, so yay for art, that were based on nature, okay? So this was these were illustrations by Fox and Brunfels, okay? So we have these German botanists, Otto Brunfels, Leonhard Fuchs, and Conrad Gessner. And they arranged genera alphabetically. So that is their key contribution. Next was Hieronymus Bock. So Hieronymus Bock was able to master floral morphology, but this did not translate into his classifications. Okay? He was able to master floral morphology. Inaral niya yung anatomy, yung morphology ng mga bulaklak, pero hindi nga lang yun na-translate sa kanyang classifications. So si Valerius Cordus, in 1544, siya yung una na nag-abandon ng blind trust sa ancient botany. Okay? So he was the first sort of lone wolf to abandon blind trust in ancient botany. And this resulted to botany reaching full maturity dahil sa kanyang mga trust issues. Okay? That is Valerius Cordus. Okay. Now, there began an increase in trade and travel from Portuguese and Spanish rules. Okay? And this resulted to more knowledge gathered. So dahil nakakapag-travel na, nagkakaroon na ng more expeditions, nagkakaroon na ng trading, nagiging curious ang mga tao sa kung ano bang meron sa other lands. And because of that, more knowledge was gathered and systematics became a necessity. Dahil sa sobrang dami nung knowledge, okay, wala na silang way to order things, okay, to make things in order. And so systematics became this necessity. We need to store, a way to store and retrieve information. Yun yung sabi nila. So in order to do this was the birth or the beginning of systematics. They made this to be able to organize and keep pace with all this knowledge coming in. Okay? Katulad lang sa filing natin, di ba? Sa mga personal files natin. When we have all these certificates, yung mga webinars na nadaluhan natin, we need a way to be able to file that and to organize it. So, ganun din sila. Yung mga notes nila, yung mga observations nila, they had to make a method in order to file and, of course, to retrieve that information. Okay? But then, during these times, there were a lot of contrasting principles. Okay? Katulad nung kanina, di ba? Yung ladder of nature. Ladder of nature and tertium non datur, or no third option, were actually contrasting. Hindi nyo ba napansin, di ba? Sa ladder of nature, there is a hierarchical arrangement, okay, of non-living things to living things, and here, walang defined barriers. Okay? Walang defined barriers. But for the tertium non datur principle, it belonged, or the species belonged to a genus or not, and there was no middle ground. So, these principles were contrasting in a way na for the ladder of nature, there were just hierarchies, okay? And within those levels, walang barriers or walang defined barriers between those living things there for each level of that ladder. But for the tertium non datur na ini-incorporate nila sa pag-group ng mga species within genus, there's no middle ground, di ba? So, yun pa lang, nakikita na natin na contrasting na yung mga principles. Pangalawa was this abstract structure of species versus the overwhelming quantity of nature. Okay? So, let's look at the abstract structure of species muna. So, 'di ba, yung abstract notion ng species kasi hindi pa siya well-defined, okay? And then, this overwhelming quantity, yung sobrang daming species, sobrang daming groups na possible. Okay? And this resulted to focusing more on defining the terms. So, mas nag-focus sila sa pagde-define, di ba? Of course, in that time, very strong yung influence ng philosophy, okay? That was education at that time. And dun sila focus sa technical terms. So, paano ba natin i-define ang species? Dun pa lang, ang dami ng different schools of thought, different opinions. So, they focus on this more than improving yung descriptions. Okay? Yung actual observations nila na makukuha from nature. Ayan. So, this brings us, okay, so, ayun na, so, alalahanin natin. So, dahil doon sa abstract structure of species and this overwhelming quantity of nature, yung contrasting principles na yun or existing situations na yun, it made them focus on technicalities rather than actual observations. So, that brings us now to the next one after Valerius Cordus was Andrea Cesalpino in 1583. Okay? So, for Andrea Cesalpino, he was technically the first botanical systematist. Okay? He had preconceived notions, yes, that were deductive, again, so nagdeduce siya, starting with natural groups that were intuitively known, but he was also inductive. Ibig sabihin, empirical siya kung ano yung actual observations niya, kung ano yung actual experience niya, yun yung ginamit niya. Okay? He did not only look at notions, but also look at what was actually happening. Andrea Cesalpino first did observations, okay, like this is the scientific method, diba? So he first observed, he then noted the significant combinations of these characteristics, and then after that, he now drew his conclusions. So because of this, because of his method, he was considered to have the first scientific attempt at classification. That is why he is technically the first botanical systematist. Okay? So of course, Andrea Cesalpino also struggled between preconceived notions and actual observations, of course, di ba? Lagi at laging may mga contradictions in that. So, he was also the first to struggle between theory and practice. Okay? Yung thinking about the facts and the facts themselves. Okay? So, eto na. Nagkakaroon na ng mga ganitong practical struggles between theory and practice. Okay? So this now brings us to the next. See? Pierre Magnol. So this is 1689. Matagal-tagal pagkatapos ni Cesalpino. Now, Pierre Magnol was the first one to make a clear plea for classification using combination of characters. So he built on as well with Cesalpino. Okay? He was the first one as well to use the term family in the way that we are now using it in taxonomy. Okay? So For Pierre, each family, katulad din tayo na may mga pamilya tayo, had this set of characteristics. And this set of characteristics was not necessarily important in all families. So, hindi necessary na pare-pareho yung mga characteristics na ginagamit para i-define yung family. Okay? So, for him, he chose the parts of plants. Okay? Like the roots, the branches, the flowers, and the seeds. Okay? So, again, the set of characteristics was not necessarily important for all families. Okay? Like for example, ang key features ng mga Alonzo ay yung kanilang noo, yung kanilang ilong, yan. Pero, yung mga to, it's not necessarily what is seen sa pamilya ng mga Guzman, kumbaga. Okay? Sa mga Guzman naman, yung complexion nila. Okay? Yun. So, parang ganun in that analogy. Okay? So, now, the struggle between notions and actual observations actually led, okay? It now led to richer discussions. So, doon naman usually nagmumula ang research, di ba? These questions. And this was a way to move forward in science, especially in systematics. We have to always remember that uncertainty is what drives science forward. Kung walang uncertainty, hindi magkakaroon ng research at hindi mapapa-question ang mga tao. Hindi sila gagawa ng ways to validate certain propositions. Okay? And that's the good thing about science. Okay? So next, we head to 1703. Yan na. So nandun na tayo sa 18th century. And we head over to John Ray. So John Ray is an Englishman. Okay? He is both a naturalist and a philosopher. Okay? For him, nature should not be limited to any method of classification. So he used purely morphological criteria and then rejected all other methods. Okay? So very radical itong si John Ray. He tried to stabilize the meaning of genus and species through facts. Okay? And he did this by assigning actual taxonomic groups of relative importance to the category genus. Okay? So he actually tried to put in groups now, to fill in groups into the category genus. Okay? And what's cool about John Ray is that he used terms such as monocotyledon, dicotyledon, and he used this based on actual experience. Ayun nga, so talagang ni-reject niya yung all other methods of classification, except classifying based on morphological criteria o kung ano yung nakikita niya sa physical na anyo. Okay? So, he used empirical data rather than deductive. Okay? So take note of that. Empirical rather than deductive. Inductive rather than deductive. So kung ano yung na-experience niya, kung ano yung actual na nakikita niya, yun yung ginamit niya. Okay? he used the logic, okay, of division, but he was not a slave to it. Okay, that is Franz Staffel's own words. Yan. So now, after, well, halos magkasabay lang sila ni John Ray, we also go to, eto na, baka mabubutcher ko na yung kanyang name. Okay? So, now we also go to Joseph Piton de Tournefort. Here, there was an increase in known plant species na. Okay, so dumadami na. And then the demand for order, of course, increased. And it coincided with that increase in known plant species. So, of course, again, like we said kanina, this order was to help quickly find which group the species belonged. Okay? And so, one of his aims, the aim of Tournefort, was to provide a key. Okay? What is a key? So, a key, hindi siya susi. But it is sort of a key na susi for us to find our way through these maze, okay, or this maze of doors, kumbaga, okay, metaphorically. So this key is a set of easily recognizable and visible, okay, take note of that, easily recognizable and visible characters. Okay, for example, you have your fruits and your flowers. Okay, so just like a key and a lock, diba? These easily recognizable and visible characters help us unlock, okay, yung mga groups na kinabibilangan nitong mga species na to. Okay? So, Tournefort placed an emphasis, okay, on names, okay, as this indispensable requirement to be able to know the medicinal properties of plants. Please remember that botany arose from that need to survive, okay? And so, definitely, it plays a key role, itong taxonomy. And Tournefort's emphasis on names is a reflection of that need, okay? Of that significance. Na kailangan alam natin yung mga definite na names ng mga plants na to para alam din natin yung kanilang exact medicinal properties. Okay? After ni Tournefort, comes in yung paborito ng lahat, and that is, of course, Linnaeus. Okay? So, because systematics is now a growing and developing field, so for Linnaeus, systematics was now this thread of Ariadne in botany. Okay? Yung systematics daw, para kay Linnaeus, ay kumbaga thread of Ariadne. Now, a little story time, okay? So, in Greek mythology, Ariadne was the daughter of King Minos. Now, King Minos was actually a demigod. He is the son of Zeus and Europa, okay? So, a hero then named Theseus needed to get through the labyrinth. So labyrinth is another term for a maze, a very complicated maze. And so what Ariadne did, dahil nga mahal niya si Theseus, ay he gave a thread to Theseus to help him successfully see his way through the labyrinth. Okay? And in Carolus Linnaeus' perspective, ganun na ganun ang systematics. Okay? So, it guides it somehow guides scientists through puzzles and problems by offering them an acceptable system. Okay? Yung mga key, yung mga methods, yung mga steps. Okay? And this was for botanists to reach the same conclusions over and over. And then so, their work becomes comparable. So, eto naman yung hinahabol natin sa science, di ba? Na maging comparable yung mga nagagawa natin, yung mga conclusions natin, yung mga results natin. Like I said, na-verify siya, na-validate siya, at same, paulit-ulit na same, yung nakukuha na results din ng iba. Okay? So, Carolus Linnaeus was quite well known for his use of the Latin language in naming species, in the binomial naming of species. So the genus comes first and then the specific epithet. Okay? It was simple, but it provided this internationally acceptable way to arrive at the same results. So he used a dead language like Latin dahil ito hindi na siya mag-evolve. Okay? Like, for example, in pop culture sa Tagalog, marami ng mga lumabas na terms dyan dahil din sa pag-unlad ng civilization natin. But because Latin is dead, wala nang nadadagdagan pang words dito. So, it was kind of a good way to start naming. Okay? Dahil alam natin na unchanging na siya. Okay? So, Linnaeus also elaborated this Turnifortian definition of a genera or of a genus, that all these species with the same geometrical design of flower parts, di ba? Kasi dun nag-focus si Tournefort. Remember, the visible, recognizable characteristics. Okay? So he used this to categorize all these species into the same genus. Okay? So again, he used all species with the same geometrical design of flower to belong to the same genus. Okay? So his criteria were number, shape, size, and proportion. Okay? So for him, these determined the essence of the genus. Okay? So he recognized classes as well, or he recognized what they would call ranks. Okay? So he recognized ranks as well, ranks. So you have the class, the order, the genus, the species, and then the variety. Okay? Yan. So, ang weakness lang siguro ni Linnaeus ay he believed that species were still unchanging. Okay? Or there is this constancy na kung ano yung nakikita nating species ngayon, yun na siya mula pa noon. Kasi he was very religious. He took Christianity as well and put that Catholic faith into his way of thinking as a scientist. Okay? And this was already considered old-fashioned before. Okay? So, for him, genera and species were realities. Okay? Na talagang may nag-exist na mga species, and these species belong to certain genera. Okay? And then, for him, classes and orders, these were simply made up already. Okay? They were already ideas. Okay? So, he was both a realist and also he accepted this nominalist thinking, or the thinking that classes and orders were just our way of organizing, okay, of better organizing. But yun nga, his only weakness is that he looked at all that we had now as already existing even before, okay, in time memorial, okay. So Linnaeus' prime achievement of his time was, of course, classification. Okay, from from the very beginning, okay, we look at classification as philosophical only, but now it was already practical. Okay? But of course, systematics is more than classification. Systematics is definitely more than that. And that leads us to Buffon and Adenson. Okay? So, before, like I said, for Linnaeus, it was considered na lahat ng mga meron na ngayon ay meron na din existing na dati. So, classification was regarded without the time element. Okay? It was assumed na lang na species did not change over time. And this is where Comte de Buffon comes in. Okay, I don't know, I might be murdering his name and I'm sorry. But Buffon was free of traditional thought. Okay? And religious influence. Okay? Kumbaga, sa pop culture, wala siyang social media accounts. Okay? So, for him, for Comte de Buffon, species is a physical identity. And this species is the sum of all individuals that form a reproductive community. Okay? Take note, reproductive community. So, for Comte de Buffon, ito yung mga organisms na pwedeng mag-procreate. Okay? Yun yung species. Comparative anatomy showed Buffon. So for him, comparative anatomy shows us that there is a general plan in the organization of groups of animals. Okay? So merong this sort of pattern na nakikita natin. So this only means na yung present independent species may have arisen from a common ancestor. So, for him, for Comte de Buffon, siguro nga, dahil nga nakikita natin na may mga certain patterns reoccurring, these individual species may have come from a common ancestor. Okay? So, siya yung unang nagbigay ng time element ngayon sa systematics. Ayan. So, it changes the game. So, he gave this genealogical element. Kasi ang phylogeny na term ay wala pa noon. So, ang ginamit niyang term ay genealogy. Okay? That, for him, a community was related through genealogy. Okay? Or common ancestry. Ayan. So, you can truly know daw a species if you consider its past and compare it with its present. Okay? So, para din tayong yung idea ni Buffon, for me, parang medyo analogous din siya sa pagkilala natin sa kapwa natin, right? So, you can only truly know someone if you look at its past, okay? And then compare that past of that person with his or her present. Okay? With their present. Ayan. So, Buffon was considered advanced in his time because first, he introduces this time element nga in systematics. Okay? He formulates the idea of phylogenetic relationship and he termed it genealogy at that time. Okay? And fourth is he formulates the biological species concept. That species is actually a physical identity. Even with this vague notion pa of population. Diba? Because this concept of population is that the same species can procreate. Okay? Yun yung population. So he had a vague notion of that, but he formulated the biological species concept. That species is a physical identity. And lastly, he was advanced for his time because genera and higher categories was actually nominal features for him. Nominal, nasa name lang. Okay? Yan. So, we just use them to be able to order, to put things in order. Okay? So, those were the key characteristics of Buffon's, of his accomplishments, of his achievements in the field of systematics. So those were the key characteristics that put him, or that make him advanced for his time. So let's look at the next one. After Buffon came Michael Adenson. So we are now in the 1750s. Ayan. So, the idea of continuity for Michael Adenson, at its most extreme, meant that nature is one and undivided, with just one universal being. Diba? Pero sa atin, it is divided. Diba? And perhaps this is sufficient. Okay? So, for Michael Adenson, what matters to him is what is presented to human reason na, yes, divided. Okay? Siguro nga, merong universal being, pero yung actual na experience natin, or yung what makes sense to human reason at this point is it is divided. Okay? And for him, perhaps that is sufficient. So, Michael Adenson can be known by making an inventory of characters to use as criteria for classification. Okay? He made an inventory of characters to use as a criteria for classification. And this was done a posteriori rather than a priori, and elaborated then Magnol's concept of family as well as genera. What does it mean with a priori? A priori is that knowledge that is independent of experience. So, before, okay, a priori, before mo ma-experience yung mga bagay na to, meron ka ng prior knowledge. Ayan. So, it is gained by analyzing facts and ideas. So, it's also attributed to theoretical thinking, to deductions. Ayan. So, yan yung a priori. Pag a posteriori, ito naman yung nagigain nating knowledge from experience. These are empirical data which are only gained after you've experienced, after you've made laboratory experiments. Okay? So, again, Michael Adenson made an inventory a posteriori. Okay? His natural method, this method of his, was the prototype of all natural systems. Okay? So, lalo na sa botany. Okay? So, again, his method, this natural method, was the prototype of all natural systems in botany. And he called this process intrinsic weighing of characters. Okay? So, he was also the first to search about the role of heredity. Okay? So, he was the first to search about hereditary mutations in speciation. And, like Buffon, he was also a proponent of hybridization, or this idea that we had a common ancestor, and there was this shared characteristics among species. Okay? So, that is Michael Adenson. Yan. go to the third and last part, the Phylogenetic Systems period. But first, we look at the term phylogeny. And according to Britannica, this is the history of the evolution of species in reference to lines of descent and relationships among broad groups of organisms. So we look at the story of a certain species by looking at its ancestry. Okay? So, we now try to tackle the theory of evolution. So, dito sa Phylogenetic Systems period, aware na sa time element ang mga scientists. And they were already largely considering the element of time in systematics. And so, here comes Alfred Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin. Okay? We are now in the 19th century. Okay? And they propose this theory of evolution by natural selection. Take note of those key terms, natural selection. So in this theory, organisms actually produce more offspring than that are able to survive, to grow, and to mature. So those that are not fit for their environment are not able to reach that age of maturity to reproduce. Okay? But those that are physically equipped will be able to survive, to grow, up to that age where they can reproduce. Okay? Natural selection is summed up as the survival of the fittest. Okay? Because the fittest organisms are those that are most suited to whatever environment they are born into. And they can now reproduce and make offspring successfully. Okay? And these traits that they have that allowed them to survive in this environment will now be passed on to their progeny or to the next generation. Okay? So that means that if your environment changes, the traits that you have that enhance survival in that certain environment will also definitely change or evolve. Kasi yung mga may traits lang na kayang endure yung certain environment na yon, sila lang yung mabubuhay. So sila lang din yung makakapag-pass on na naman ng traits na yon that help them survive to the next generation. Okay, so now they understood, they began to see, oh my gosh, pwede nga. That's why natural selection became this such powerful idea, compelling them, okay, to explain the evolution of life. And this now became an established scientific theory. Okay? Yan. So, the theory of evolution. So, in this third period, we now look at two people. Okay? The last two, Adolf Engler. He is a German botanist. So, Adolf Engler developed this system, which is now widely used in America and European continents, and of course, the scientific community. And Engler divides the plant kingdom into 13 divisions. Okay? So, here in his 13 divisions, the 13th is the Embryophyta Siphonomma. Okay? which is the spermatophyta, okay, or the seed-bearing plants. And within this division, there are two other divisions, which are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, termed gymnospermae and angiospermae. And within the angiospermae are two classes, monocotyledonae and dicotyledonae. Okay? And here, we know now that the early seed ferns gave rise to the gymnosperm group, including the pines, spruce, firs, and we now know as well that flowering plants known as our angiosperms probably came from the gymnosperm phase, which have now the two groups. So these flowering plants have the two groups, the dicotyledons and the monocotyledons. So the dicotyledons have, again, a pair of leaves, diba? Or the cotyledon, okay, in the embryo of the seed. And your monocotyledon, contrary to that, has naman one leaf in the embryo of the seed. Now, what can be merited to Adolf Engler? What is merited to him is the phylogenetic system, okay? That plant groups are arranged mostly according to evolutionary affinities. Okay? So this means that the primitive groups are followed by the more advanced groups. Okay? So inarrange niya siya using timelines. Okay? And then next was another that could be merited to Adolf Engler was that anatomical data, okay, was finally taken into consideration in classifying. Okay? So we can remember, diba, that morphological features was also used before. Yes? Ayan. So who, again, was the one who looked at morphological features as a way of classifying instead of other classification methods. Okay? Diba? John Ray, he rejected all other classification schemes and only looked at morphological criteria. Now, here naman, for Engler, he used anatomy. Okay? So, he used anatomy to look at the system of classification. Okay? The only thing that is looked at as a weakness to Engler, according to an article by Arthur Cronquist, is how he equates simplicity to primitivity. And as we can see now, that is not the case, diba? We have invertebrates that are very simple in design, but are actually parasites, but are actually survivors, but are actually deadly. Ayan. Okay? And lastly, we look at Charles Bessey. Bessemer. Ayan. So, Charles Bessey is a proponent of the Ranalian school of thought. And this was modified by J. Hutchinson. Okay? So, according to them, angiosperm arose from the gymnosperm. Okay? According to this school of thought. And this also looks at the modern system of flowering plant classification. Okay? And this is largely influenced by the phylogenetic dichots given by Charles Bessey, okay, who looked at seed plants as polyphyletic. Okay? So, polyphyly will be more emphasized and elaborated as well in our next lessons. Okay? Yan. So, these are all the whole history, okay, of systematics. Okay, this is just an overview. Of course, there are a lot more scientists that are not named here, and I leave that to you as well to look into. Okay, so I hope you learned much from the reading written by Franz Taflu and from this short discussion on the history of systematics. So, thank you everyone for listening, and I hope that you have a great day. Bye!